The Old West was nothing like Hollywood made it look. No clean duels and no heroes in white hats. It was disease, poison, bodies being sold, and death waiting around every corner. And these are the facts the movies were too afraid to tell. If you like raw, unfiltered history, subscribe now, because it only gets worse. Number 1. The outlaw who became an amusement park attraction. In October 1911, in the state of Oklahoma, an outlaw named Elmer McCurdy was killed in a shootout with the police after a robbery went wrong. No one came to claim the body. With no family nearby, the undertaker decided to embalm McCurdy with an arsenic-based substance so strong that the body dried out and hardened like wood. Then came the strange part. The man started charging a few cents to anyone who wanted to take a look at the outlaw who wouldn't rot. It worked so well that people came from far away just to see it. Over the years, the body changed hands again and again, going from fair to circus, from circus to haunted house, always treated like a wax figure, and no one suspected a thing. Until 1976, during a film shoot inside an amusement park in Long Beach, California, an employee bumped into what he thought was a mannequin. The arm came off immediately. Underneath the paint was real human bone. Number 2. Wyoming, 1881. George Parrott, the outlaw known as Big Nose, already had blood on his hands. During a train robbery that went wrong, he killed 2 lawmen who were tracking him down. He ended up in jail in Rawlins, but he did not stay quiet. He tried to escape and attacked the jailer. That was the last straw. A mob stormed the jail, dragged the outlaw out, and hanged him in the middle of the street. But the strangest part came after his death. The town doctor, John Osborne, took possession of the body and did something no one could have imagined. He cut skin from the outlaw's chest and legs and had it made into a pair of shoes. As a keepsake, he also kept a piece of the skull. Now get this. Years later, that same doctor went into politics and was elected governor of Wyoming. And according to the story, he showed up at his inauguration ball wearing those shoes made from the skin of the man the town itself had lynched. Number 3. The family that murdered guests with a hammer. In the early 1870s, travelers passing through rural Kansas would stop to rest at a small inn in Labette County. The place was run by the Bender family, the father, the mother, their son John Jr., and their daughter Kate, German immigrants who pretended to be simple, welcoming people. But inside, a trap was waiting. The traveler would be invited to sit in a chair with his back to a cloth curtain. While he ate, someone on the other side would raise a hammer and crush his skull from behind. Then they would slit his throat and drop the body through a trap door into the basement. Later, they buried everything in the apple orchard right there in the backyard. At least 11 bodies were found on the property. The search began when a local doctor disappeared and his brother, a colonel, went looking for answers. By the time the law closed in on them in 1873, the Benders had already vanished. No one ever laid eyes on them again. Number 4. The man who ate his 5 companions. In the winter of 1874, 6 men headed into Colorado's San Juan Mountains in search of gold. Only one came back. Alfred Packer made it through the blizzard alone, well-fed and with the other 5 men's money in his pocket. People got suspicious right away. Where were his companions? Packer told one story, then changed it to another, and then another. In the end, he admitted it. Trapped in the snow, with no food and no way out, he ate the bodies of the men who had died, so he wouldn't die too. The justice system didn't buy the whole story and convicted him. That's when the case's most famous legend was born. They say the judge looked at him and snapped that Packer had eaten half the Democrats in the county. True or not, the details stuck and never went away. More than 100 years later, Colorado still tells the story of the prospector who went up the mountain with 5 friends and came down alone with a full stomach. Number 5. They took family photos with the dead. It may seem strange today, but in the Old West, it was common. Back then, cameras were expensive, and many people were never photographed even once in their entire lives. So, when someone in the household died, that was often the family's only chance to have a picture of that person. They dressed the body in its best clothes, combed the hair, and sat it in a chair as if the person were still alive. With children, the scene was even harder to take. The mother would hold her dead baby in her arms while the photographer worked. No one saw anything wrong with it. It was mourning, it was remembrance, and it didn't stop there. When a famous outlaw was killed, like Jesse James, the body became a public attraction. They tied the man to a board, stood him upright, and sold copies of the photo to anyone willing to pay. There in the Old West, even death made money. Number 6. The whiskey that was actual poison. In the Old West, what a cowboy ordered at the saloon bar was almost never real whiskey. Aged liquor was expensive and took a long time to reach frontier towns, so the bartender came up with his own solution. He took cheap, pure alcohol and mixed it with whatever he had on hand, chewing tobacco, red pepper, and molasses for color. According to accounts from the time, they also threw in a little kerosene and sometimes even strychnine to give it that kick. The nickname said it all, coffin varnish. They also called it tanglefoot because after a few drinks, a man could barely walk straight. And there was 40 rod, a name that came from the joke that the drink could knock you down from 40 rods away. But it wasn't always a joke. A lot of men went blind or died because of what was in their own glass, long before any bullet ever crossed their path. Number 7. The morphine epidemic no one talks about. When the Civil War ended, many soldiers came home with more than scars. They came home addicted. In field hospitals, morphine was the only thing that could ease the pain of an amputated arm or a bullet lodged in the body. The problem was that afterward, no one could quit. Addiction became so common among veterans that it got its own name, the soldier's disease. But it didn't stop with them. Back then, you could walk into any corner drugstore and buy laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol, without a prescription and without anyone asking questions. Mothers gave spoonfuls to their babies to stop them from crying at night. And here's the part almost no one imagines. Respectable housewives, the kind who went to church on Sundays, were addicted to opium without ever setting foot inside an opium den. Addiction wore a dress and lived next door. Number 8. They treated syphilis with mercury and killed the patient. In the Old West, syphilis ran rampant through cattle towns. These places were packed with saloons, brothels, and men who spent months away from home driving cattle. The problem was that medicine at the time had no idea how to treat the disease. Doctors put their faith in mercury, the same metal we now know is pure poison. They told patients to rub it on their skin, inhale the fumes, or even swallow it. The damage was terrible. Their teeth fell out, saliva ran uncontrollably from their mouths, and their hands started shaking on their own. Many died from poisoning before syphilis even took its toll. In practice, the treatment killed faster than the disease itself. That's how a saying was born that lasted for generations. One night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury. A phrase that perfectly summed up the high price those men paid for a single night. Number 9. When you think of the Old West, you probably picture a woman from a brothel dying in a shootout. But the truth was much quieter. The so-called soiled doves almost never died from bullets. What really killed them was the bottle. These women lived trapped. They arrived at the brothel already owing money and could never pay off the debt. To get through the routine, most of them ended up turning to opium. Laudanum, that mixture of opium and alcohol sold at any drugstore, became their escape. It was cheap, easy to find, and deadly. Life there was short. No rights, no family nearby, no way out in sight. When the burden became too much, many deliberately took a large dose of laudanum. That was the most common way to end it all. And here's the hardest part. The town almost never recorded who they were. They died nameless, were buried far away, and were quickly forgotten. The history of the West remembered the gunslingers, but erased their faces. Number 10. Boot Hill, the cemetery where you were buried with your boots on. In the Old West, you could tell how a man had died just by looking at where he ended up. In towns like Tombstone, Arizona, and Dodge City, Kansas, there was a cemetery people called Boot Hill. The name came from an expression used at the time. Someone who died with his boots on was someone who died suddenly and violently in a shootout, a bar fight, or at the end of a rope. There wasn't even time to take off his shoes. Most of the people buried there didn't even have a last name written down. The headstones carried only phrases like "unknown, shot to death." Many didn't even get a coffin. The body was wrapped in a blanket and lowered straight into the hole. There were no flowers, no preacher, no final goodbye. It was the end of the line for gunslingers, gamblers, and strangers no one came to claim. And the most surprising part, a large number of them were under 30 when they ended up beneath that ground. Number 11. They stole fresh corpses for medical schools. Imagine burying someone in your family and finding the grave open and empty the next morning. In the early 19th century, this happened more often than we might think. Medical schools needed bodies to teach anatomy, but the law left almost none available. That's when a dark market was born. Men known as resurrectionists worked in the middle of the night with shovels and hooks, digging up people who had been buried only hours earlier. They sold the bodies directly to professors who paid well and asked no questions. Their favorite targets were cemeteries for the poor, immigrants, and communities with no power, because those families had no way to complain or pay someone to guard the grave. Many relatives started keeping watch at night, armed and waiting for the thieves. It was only after the law was completely changed that this trade in the dead finally came to an end. Number 12. John Wesley Hardin killed a man just because he was snoring too loudly. Think about that for a second. Hardin was one of the most feared gunslingers Texas had ever seen, and he claimed to have killed more than 40 men over the course of his life. But maybe the best-known story is this one. One night, at a hotel in Abilene, Kansas, the guy snoring in the room next door was keeping Hardin awake. Without thinking twice, he pulled out his revolver and fired through the wall, killing the man in his sleep. Years later, Hardin ended up spending a long time in prison, and it was behind bars that he did something no one expected. He studied, learned the law, and became a real lawyer. But the past always catches up with you. In 1895, inside a saloon in El Paso, while he was rolling dice at the bar, a man came up behind him and shot him in the back of the head. That was how the life of one of the deadliest men in the Old West came to an end. Number 13. Geronimo died drunk after falling off his horse. For more than 20 years, the most feared man in the Old West lived as a prisoner of the very government that claimed to have defeated him. The Apache leader who kept the U.S. Army up at night ended up as a fairground attraction. At the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, he sat there selling autographs and even pulled buttons off his own coat to sell as souvenirs. Each button went for a few cents. The warrior had become a souvenir. The end was even harsher. On a cold night in 1909, already close to 80 years old, he was heading home after drinking in town. Along the way, he fell off his horse and could not get back up. He lay on the frozen ground for hours near a creek until someone found him the next morning. He came down with pneumonia and died a few days later, still a prisoner, far from the land where he was born. The man the entire army could not bring down was defeated by a fall from a horse and a night out in the cold. Number 14. They paid bounties for human scalps. In the early 19th century, northern Mexican states like Chihuahua and Sonora were constantly being raided by Apaches. The solution they came up with was brutal. They put a price on their heads. Literally. The government paid cash to anyone who turned in Apache scalps, around 100 pesos for an adult warrior and smaller amounts for women and children. And that was when everything went off the rails. Men like John Glanton and James Kirker showed up and turned it into a profitable business. The problem was simple. No one could look at a piece of scalp and tell who it had belonged to. Dark hair was dark hair, so these hunters started killing anyone who fit the bill. Ordinary Mexicans, peaceful native people, and people who had nothing to do with the raids. In the end, the same government that created the system was paying for the deaths of its own people. Number 15. The man who killed Lincoln's assassin lost his mind because of Mercury. Pay attention to this story. Boston Corbett was the soldier who pulled the trigger on John Wilkes Booth in 1865, days after Booth assassinated President Abraham Lincoln. He should have become a hero. But his life took a very strange turn. Before the war, Corbett made hats. Back then, mercury was used in the process, and he breathed in those fumes for years. The metal slowly ate away at his mind. It is no wonder there is even the old expression, mad as a hatter. And things only got worse. Consumed by religious fanaticism, he mutilated himself with a pair of scissors. In 1887, while working in Topeka, he pulled out a revolver inside the Kansas House of Representatives and pointed it at the people there. He ended up locked away in an insane asylum. But in 1888, he escaped, got on a horse, and disappeared. No one ever found out what happened to him. Number 16. The outlaw's head spent 50 years inside a jar of whiskey. Imagine paying $1 just to see a dead man's head floating inside a glass jar. That is what thousands of people did in California for decades. It belonged to Joaquin Murrieta, a Mexican man who became a legend during the gold rush. Some called him a murderer. Others swore he only wanted revenge against the prospectors who killed his brother and humiliated his family. In 1853, the government put a price on his head. A group of California Rangers, led by Harry Love, hunted him down and killed him. To prove who they had caught and collect the reward, they cut off Joaquin's head and the hand of an accomplice nicknamed Three-Fingered Jack. They put everything in alcohol and took it from town to town for people to see. The gruesome trophy spent half a century at fairs, charging $1 for a look, until it disappeared in the Great San Francisco earthquake of 1906. Number 17. He carried a man's ear in his pocket like it was loose change. Joseph Jack Slade was an agent for a stagecoach line in the Old West. His job was to keep the roads safe. The problem was, he became the biggest danger on them. It all started with Jules Benny, a rival who ran a stage station. The two hated each other. One day, Benny pulled his gun and pumped Slade full of bullets, leaving him lying on the ground, nearly dead. Slade survived, and he never forgot. Months later, his men captured Benny. Slade tied him up and killed him slowly. Before leaving, he cut off his enemy's ears. One of them traveled around with him in his pocket, on display for anyone who wanted to see it. Over time, alcohol took over. Slade fought with and threatened everyone wherever he went, terrorizing Montana. The people finally ran out of patience. In 1864, the Virginia City vigilantes caught him, put up a gallows, and hanged him right there. Number 18. The hunter who came back with their heads in a sack. In Colorado in 1863, few names struck more fear than the Espinosas. Felipe Nerio and his brother Vivian started killing American settlers one after another, and they claimed it was not a crime, but an order from heaven. Felipe swore he had seen the Virgin Mary telling him to spill Anglo blood over the land his family had lost after the war with Mexico. When an armed group killed Vivian, Felipe did not stop. He brought in his own nephew, Jose Vicente, and the killing continued. In the end, the death toll reached as high as 32. The army had plenty of soldiers and still could not catch the two of them. That was when the commander of Fort Garland called in an old local hand, tracker Tom Tobin. Within a few days, Tobin found the camp, cornered the pair, and left no one alive. Then he cut off their heads, threw them into a burlap sack, and returned to the fort, where he dropped them in front of the officers as proof that the nightmare was over. Factual adjustments I made. Felipe's final partner was his nephew Jose Vicente, not his brother Vivian, who had already been killed by an armed group, and I included the detail about the supposed vision of the Virgin Mary and the loss of land after the war with Mexico, which was the justification Felipe used for his so-called divine mission. The number of victims most often cited in the sources is 32. Number 19. The jury that decided the hanged man died of emphysema. In 1883, 5 outlaws robbed a store in Bisbee, Arizona, and left people dead on the floor. The town pointed the finger at John Heath, accused of being the mastermind behind the job. But in court, he escaped the gallows. He got life in prison, while the 5 robbers were sentenced to death. The people were not having it. On February 22, 1884, a mob stormed the Tombstone jail, dragged Heath through the streets, and hanged him from a telegraph pole. Now comes the part no one believes. To protect everyone involved in the lynching, the coroner's jury refused to call it murder. On paper, they wrote that Heath died from emphysema of the lungs, a disease common at high altitudes, which may have been, and probably was, caused by strangulation. In other words, an entire town hanged a man from a pole, and the paperwork said no one was to blame. Number 20. The gang of boys that brought Indian Territory to its knees. In the summer of 1895, 5 very young men, led by Rufus Buck, decided they wanted to become more famous than any outlaw in the Old West, and they went about it in the worst possible way. Alongside Buck were Lewis Davis, Lucky Davis, Sam Sampson, and Mayoma July. Over the course of about 2 weeks, they terrorized Indian Territory. They robbed stores and farms, attacked families, and killed Deputy U.S. Marshal John Garrett. But their rampage did not last long. In August, U.S. Marshals and the Native Light Horse Police surrounded the 5 near Muskogee and arrested them after a long shootout. They were all taken to Fort Smith, Arkansas, to face Judge Isaac Parker, the so-called hanging judge. The sentence came quickly. On July 1, 1896, all 5 stepped onto the same scaffold and were hanged side by side. Number 21. The town that hanged the same man twice because of a photograph. Skidoo was a tiny mining town in the middle of Death Valley, California. On April 19, 1908, a bartender named Joe "Hooch" Simpson walked into the store owned by local shopkeeper Jim Arnold and shot him dead over just $20. 3 days later, an angry mob dragged Hooch to a telegraph pole and hanged him right there without a trial. The next morning, they cut the body down and buried it. But it did not end there. Days later, a Los Angeles Times reporter showed up wanting a picture of the hanged man. Since the man was already underground, the townspeople dug up the body, shook off the dirt, and hanged him again just to get the picture in the newspaper. And there was more. The town doctor cut off the dead man's head to see whether syphilis had driven him insane. Today, all that remains of Skidoo is a sign standing alone in the desert. Number 22. In Arizona, there is a cemetery called Boot Hill in the town of Tombstone. It is the kind of place where a lot of people ended up after an argument turned into a shootout. And among all those graves, one became the most photographed of them all. It belongs to a man named Lester Moore. He worked at a Wells Fargo station, handling packages and mail. One day, a customer showed up complaining about a package that had arrived damaged. The argument got more and more heated. Neither man was willing to back down, and they both pulled their revolvers. Lester took 4 bullets from a .44. The other man did not make it either. When it was time to bury Lester, someone wrote a line on his headstone that went down in history. "Here lies Lester Moore, 4 slugs from a .44, no less, no more," meaning no more less. To this day, no one really knows who he was before that day, but thanks to that pun, his name was never forgotten. Number 23, the man who escaped the gallows at the very last second, and not just once. Idaho, 1896. Back then, in the Old West, cattle ranchers and sheep herders were constantly fighting over land and water. It was in the middle of this conflict that 2 herders, Daniel Cummings and John Wilson, were found shot to death at their camp. The blame quickly fell on Jackson Lee Davis, known as Diamondfield Jack, a gunman hired by a cattle company who often bragged about shooting sheep herders. He was tried and sentenced to hang in 1897. But the day before his execution, 2 other men confessed to the murders, and the hanging was called off at the last minute. Years later, the execution was scheduled again. They say Jack was already standing on the scaffold when a rider came galloping in, holding the order that stopped the rope once again. In the end, his sentence was changed to life in prison, and in 1902 he was pardoned. He walked free, headed to Nevada, and even became rich from silver mines. Number 24. He sold autographed pictures of himself while waiting to be hanged. Tiburcio Vasquez was one of California's last great outlaws. Born into a Mexican family in a land the Americans had just taken over, he spent years robbing stagecoaches and stores across the state. In 1873, a robbery in the small town of Tres Pinos left 3 men dead, and that was when things got serious. A hefty bounty was put on his head. The following year, the manhunt closed in, and he was captured near Los Angeles. It was in jail that the story got strange. Vasquez became an attraction. High society people lined up to meet the outlaw, women came to visit him, and he knew how to make the most of his fame. He had portraits taken, signed them one by one, and sold them to pay for his own lawyers. It did not help. In March 1875, he was hanged in San Jose in front of a crowd that came to watch the end of the man who smiled for the camera until his final day. Number 25. The family war in which a corpse was fought over by pigs. In 1880s Arizona, before it even became a state, 2 clans lived side by side in Pleasant Valley, the Grahams and the Tewksburys. They started out as friends, helped build each other's cabins, and ended up trying to wipe each other out. The reason? Cattle, sheep, land, and old grudges no one was willing to forgive. In September 1887, the Grahams surrounded the Tewksbury Ranch before dawn. They killed John Tewksbury and William Jacobs when the 2 went out to get the horses. Then they stayed on the hillside with guns in hand, refusing to let anyone get near the bodies. That was when things turned gruesome. A group of pigs began eating the dead men lying on the ground right in front of the house. Mary Ann, John's widow and nearly 9 months pregnant, grabbed a shovel and walked out in the middle of the gunfire to dig a grave and bury her husband. By the time it was all over, nearly an entire generation of both clans had disappeared. Number 26. The 2 outlaws who died shooting and became a souvenir photograph. It was July 4th, 1884, Lewistown, Montana's first Independence Day, in a village that had only recently become a real town. In the middle of the celebration, 2 cattle rustlers showed up. Rattlesnake Jake Fallon and his partner, Ed Harry Owen. They started drinking early and, already drunk, went around picking fights with anyone who passed by. They even beat up a man dressed as Uncle Sam and forced people to jump over the bullets they fired into the ground. The town had enough. A local man stood up to the pair, and it turned into a shootout in the middle of the street. The 2 did not run. They stayed there, trading shots with half the town until they went down. Each man took close to 10 bullets. When the dust settled, both were lying dead in the street. Someone had the idea to photograph the bodies, and the pictures spread across the country as a gruesome souvenir of the frontier. To this day, what is said to be Jake's skull remains in a museum in town. Number 27. The death lottery where a simple bean decided who lived. In the winter of 1842, a group of Texans crossed the border and attacked the Mexican town of Mier. They were defeated and captured. On the way to prison, they attempted a daring escape, but the desert beat them before the soldiers captured them again. General Santa Anna's revenge was cold. 1 out of every 10 men would die. To decide who, they filled a jar with 176 beans, 159 white, and 17 black. One by one, the prisoners reached inside while blindfolded, unable to see what they were pulling out. White bean, you stayed alive. Black bean, you were shot on the spot. They say some prayed under their breath, while others just stared at the ground. In the end, 17 drew the wrong color and fell before the firing squad in March 1843. It became known as the Black Bean episode, the day when luck, not justice, decided who kept breathing. Number 28. The Army payroll robbery, an ambush that was never solved. Imagine carrying a fortune in gold across the Arizona desert without knowing the road ahead was already a trap. That is what happened on May 11, 1889. Major Joseph Wham was carrying more than $28,000 in gold and silver coins to pay the troops, escorted by a group of Buffalo soldiers. Along the way, a huge boulder blocked the road. When the wagon stopped, the outlaws opened fire from behind a rock barricade on top of the hill. The shootout lasted nearly half an hour. 8 soldiers were wounded, but none were killed, and their bravery earned 2 medals of honor. Even so, the robbers escaped with all the money. The police arrested several local residents and took the case to trial. One by one, they were all acquitted. The gold was never found, and to this day, no one knows who was behind the robbery. Number 29. The shootout in a cattle town that turned into revenge in the middle of the night. In the summer of 1871, Newton, Kansas, was the end of the line for Texas cattle. New railroad tracks, saloons open all night, and armed men everywhere. Days earlier, police officer Mike McCluskey had killed a Texan named Billy Bailey in a street fight, and Bailey's friends swore they would settle the score. In the early hours of August 20th at Tuttle's Dance Hall, cowboy Hugh Anderson walked in, went straight up to McCluskey, and shot him. Then came the part no one expected. James Riley, an 18-year-old who was dying of tuberculosis and owed his life to McCluskey, pulled 2 revolvers and started shooting everyone through the smoke. When the gunfire stopped, 5 men were dead and several others were wounded. Riley walked out the door and was never seen again. It became known as the Great Newton Massacre, one of the bloodiest shootouts in the old cattle towns. Number 30. The Great Hanging at Gainesville. October 1862, North Texas, in the middle of the Civil War. Fear took over Cook County. Rumors spread that local men belonged to a secret group loyal to the Union. What happened next went down in history as the largest mass lynching the United States had ever seen. Without a real trial, Colonel James Borland gathered the militia and arrested more than 150 men. Instead of a legitimate court, they set up a citizens' court with 12 hand-picked jurors. 7 of them were slave owners. And there was one disturbing detail: a simple majority vote was enough to convict. One by one, the accused were taken to an old elm tree outside town. Around 40 men ended up hanging from that branch, many of them innocent. 2 others were shot and killed while trying to escape. Today, a memorial in Gainesville bears the names of the 42 victims of that October.